to try and share my PowerPoint. I hope you can all see this now. And I'm also trying to look for one of your images because I don't see any now. Maybe somebody can give me a thumbs up if this is working fine, if you hear me fine.
We can see it well, yeah.
Oh, okay, great. And there's a thumbs up too. Okay, wonderful. So many thanks again for the invitation. I'm very pleased and honored to speak to you here. I think it's wonderful to have such a forum to read Scotland together, to take up the title, and I'm also very much looking forward to our discussion. And there's quite a few Stevensonians in the room, so I'm all the more looking forward to feedback on my thoughts. I usually spend my Tuesday evenings on trains, but I also hope to be back for later events. Many of you will also be familiar with it, but I thought I'd also use the opportunity to spread the word about the Scottish Literature and Culture Network that Julia Boll and Nina Engelhardt have put together, that I'm also part of. For example, they're organizing a teaching workshop online on the 31st of January. So if anyone's interested in that, I can also recommend that. It's been a long day for me of seminars and lectures since 8 a.m. I've been discussing Virginia Woolf's Orlando, Marlowe's Faustus, the poems of Phyllis Wheatley and Anna Letitia Barbeau. So I really hope for the best with regard to my voice and also my mind. But I imagine it's been a long day for everyone, so I'm all the more glad to end it with a discussion of Stevenson. I'm not really a Stevensonian per se, but as you've already heard, my interest in Jekyll and Hyde dates back to my Edinburgh days in 2008. Today I'm coming to Stevenson from my research interests in the Gothic, in authorship, and in invisibility, and there's hardly a text out there that combines these in such fascinating fashion as does Stevenson's A Chapter on Dreams. What follows is very much work in progress on this text, and I look forward to discuss it. Incidentally, perhaps for the Q&A, I'd be especially curious what you make of the word chapter in the title of the text. But first, I basically have to give you the double title, or the real title of the talk. As always, there's been a bit of a change in emphasis, and this describes more closely what I'm actually arguing. Stevenson's A Chapter on Dreams as a textual double of Jekyll and Hyde. And this is a rough outline of what I plan to do. I'm going to start out with situating Stevenson in the tradition of the authorial auto-commentary, particularly through a comparison to Poe, and also speak more generally about author fictions in the late 19th century. I will then move to the historical context of brain science and psychoanalysis, and then really focus on the text itself, A Chapter on Dreams, first on the metaphor of the theatre of the brain, and then on textual similarities to Jekyll and Hyde. I will end with a conclusion, but before that I'd also look at Stevenson's brownies as invisible literary doubles. So without further ado, the authorial auto-commentary and author fictions of the late 19th century. My paper explores Robert Louis Stevenson's Gothic doppelganger, so familiar to us from his 1886 novella Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. My focus will be less on how Stevenson's version of Scottish Gothic is haunted by the political past and to what extent it can envision an imagined community for the future. Rather, I shall examine the haunting multiplication of selves in the present in Stevenson's essay, A Chapter on Dreams. This essay is a textual self-commentary or auto-commentary on the novella of Jekyll and Hyde, but it is also, to a larger extent than generally assumed, a text that works on its own on both critical and narrative levels. Unlike the dark, fractured doppelganger in Jekyll and Hyde, Stevenson's reflections on authorship invoke the brownies, a humorous and invisible version of the Gothic double, to illuminate the multiplication of selves in his writing process. A Chapter on Dreams was written by Stevenson while in the United States in October 1887 and first published in Scribner's Magazine on the 3rd of January 1888. Scholarly work often addresses A Chapter on Dreams as an anticipation of early 20th century occupations, such as the Freudian psychoanalysis of dreams. My aim in approaching the text is twofold. One, to situate Stevenson's authorial auto-commentary intertextually, that is, both in relation to earlier auto-commentaries by Gothic writers, such as Mary Shelley and Edgar Allan Poe, and to other 19th century variations of the double. and 2, to argue for a reading of a chapter on dreams that views the text itself as a narrative double of Jekyll and Hyde. While this has to be taken with a grain of salt, Gérard Genette argues that Poe's The Philosophy of Composition, published in 1846 on the composition of the Raven, inaugurated the modern tradition of authorial auto-commentaries. I argue that a chapter on dreams performs a doubling of the narrative logic of Strange Case, akin to how Poe's 1846 auto-commentary, The Philosophy of Composition, doubles the poetic progression of the Raven. A key difference between Stevenson's and Poe's authorial poetics lies in the brownies in a chapter on dreams. Stevenson refers to them as my unseen collaborators, a metaphor that delineates a positively connoted mythological, collective, and invisible double of the author. In this characteristic double and multiple figuration of the creative process, Stevenson's choice of a mythological theatre of dreams contrasts with Poe's rhetorical mathematics of memory. And I have this in a bit of an overview for both of the texts here. This contrast becomes even clearer when we compare Poe's and Stevenson's authorial self-commentaries published in American magazines in 1846 and 1888, and look to how they reframe their popular successes, Poe's The Raven and Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde. Poe's Philosophy of Composition mimics the progression of The Raven in that it ends with a quote from the original text. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. Similarly, Stevenson's A Chapter on Dreams doubles the progression of Jekyll and Hyde with a pronoun shift revealing that the dreamer Stevenson has been talking about throughout the text is, quote, no less a person than myself. This, of course, parallels the final denouement in Jekyll and Hyde, or, the one that we're already aware of before we start reading it these days. And I'll talk more about this later on. The greatest difference between the two auto-commentaries is that Poe emphasizes that authors create their own rules for writing in an autonomous view of authorship. Poe also argues that writing is based on one's own discourses and techniques rather than those of others. Again, an autonomous or autologous view of authorship. In contrast, Stevenson's focus on dreams and the unconscious foregrounds the heteronymous conditions of authorship as they extend from economic conditions to the demands of artistic perfection and the already mentioned unseen collaborators of the brownies. While Poe's philosophy of composition is central for the history of authorial auto-commentaries, Stevenson's contemporaries were, of course, also invested in conceptualizing and narrating authorship, the most obvious name coming to mind being that of Henry James. With regard to the history of the double, Ingo Behrensmeyer's view of the self-representation of authors in his recently published monograph, Author Fictions, Narrative Representations of Literary Authorship Since 1800, is instructive. Behrensmeyer has shown how metafictional representations of literary authorship within literary texts, which he calls author fictions, turn towards split personalities in the late 19th century. His examples include Henry James, Rudyard Kipling, and Max Beerbohm. In stories such as James's The Private Life of 1892, Behrensmeyer argues, the writer, quote, needs to have two personae, two identities, one for society and one for privacy, unquote. This is a requirement that is also connected to the emergence of literary doppelgangers within Gothic author fictions. This eruption of the fantastic into author fictions around 1900 is attributed by Behrensmeyer to the increasing number of Gothic texts at the fin de siècle, but also as, quote, an indication that the mimetic representation of the topic of authorship has reached its limit, unquote. Often told in short stories, narratives of literary authorship of the time have exhausted the resources of the Bildungsroman as they anticipate the development of the Künstlerroman with its shift to the isolated artist in conflict with society. And you can see a really abbreviated version of Behrensmeyer's narrative on the slide here. So his take is basically that within realism, the literary Bildungsroman offers the materials for author fictions, but that this ends around Stevenson's time. and before the advent of modernism and its focus on impersonality. Behrensmeyer's delineation of the tectonic shifts within within literary author fictions helps us to historically situate the non-fictional counterparts to literary author fictions of the time, including authorial author commentaries such as Stevenson's. Against this background, Stevenson's musing on his own authorship in a chapter on dreams acquire additional salience for a history of authorship of the late Victorian period, but also for thinking through the implications of today's critical terminology, centering, for example, around autofiction and auto theory. My arguments today extend Behrensmeyer's insights into the Gothic figurations of authorship at the fin de siècle to Stevenson's peculiar textual double. Stevenson occupies, I argue, a middle position between the autonomous and heteronymous poles on the scale of authorship, as he thinks and imagines the multiplicity and collectivity of singular authorship. So while in contrast to Poe, he stresses the heteronymous aspects, I will also show that he's really moving along this scale of authorship. That brings me to my second section, on Stevenson and the doubles of brain science and psychoanalysis. Much of our interpretation of Jekyll and Hyde as a double depends not only on the literary precursors and followers, but also on which historical contexts we foreground. For example, Stephen Arata's discussion of a chapter on dreams reads it as a description of Stevenson's literary artistry and technique, as well as in anticipation of Freudian concepts of the dream and the uncanny. Stevenson's text, a chapter on dreams, certainly anticipates the strong relationship between dreams as a sign of the unconscious, and also to Freud's 1907 paper on creative writers and daydreaming. A line has also been drawn from Stevenson to Freud in a more general fashion, and Stiles, for instance, notes how Jekyll and Hyde functions as a literary harbinger of crucial innovations in 20th century psychiatry, and virtually, Stiles argues, anticipates Freud's critique of the imbalance between powerful rational psychiatrist and his objectified, often female patient. In terms of poetics, Stevenson's and Freud's common focus on dreams as the origin of literary creativity makes them similar, though their differences are instructive too. Where Stevenson focuses on dreams and nightmares at night during sleep, Freud discusses mostly daydreaming, which has made it into the English title of the paper as a translation of the German nominalized verb das Fantasieren. In this emphasis on daydreaming, Freud's paper is actually less similar to Stevenson's authorial auto-commentary, but quite similar to the account that Mary Shelley gave of the composition of Frankenstein in her introduction to its third edition, written in 1831. Shelley speaks of her childhood pleasures as the formation of castles in the air and the indulging in waking dreams. What makes her apposite for a talk in the context of reading Scotland is that she foregrounds in particular her time as a girl spent in Scotland on the northern shores of Tay near Dundee. In her account, the origin of Frankenstein did not lie in a dream, but in a daydream. I saw, she says, with shut eyes, but acute mental vision. I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together, unquote. While the character Frankenstein in the novel sleeps and is awakened by his creature, Shelley's vision remains a waking one throughout, a clear example of Freudian daydreaming. In my reading of Stevenson, I would like to focus less on what Stevenson anticipates in Freud, but rather what his text emerges from. Here, earlier 19th century psychological research on mind and brain is of particular interest. While Anne Stiles' interpretation of the significance of Victorian brain science for Jekyll and Hyde leaves something to be desired with regard to the earlier literary history of the double, her argument for reading Jekyll and Hyde is based on the earlier physiological examination of the brain as consisting of two hemispheres needs to be taken into account. As Stiles outlines, the late 19th century history of studies of mind and brain indicates that there was a fundamental difference between dual and multiple personality. Quote, the etiology of multiple personality disorder, childhood trauma, is radically different from dual personality, which was thought to result from a physical problem, specifically bilateral brain hemisphere asymmetry, unquote. In Stiles' physiological or neuroscientific reading, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde may be attributed to different hemispheres of the brain. Quote, Jekyll exhibits left hemisphere attributes, masculinity, whiteness, logic, intelligence, humanness, while Hyde embodies right hemisphere traits, femininity, racial indeterminacy, madness, emotion, and animality, unquote. For Stiles, this hemispheric quality is mirrored in their bodily sidedness, with Hyde, the inverse to Jekyll, likely writing with his left hand because of his right brain dominance. Stiles even uses this logic to link to Stevenson's A Chapter on Dreams, arguing that, quote, since Stevenson claimed that the idea for Jekyll and Hyde came to him in a dream, one might justifiably argue that the tale was a product of the author's right brain hemisphere, unquote. As I show later, this theory about the physiological origin of the novella offers little with regard to the form of the essay, A Chapter on Dreams. There is not enough time to go into detail into the various 19th century medical cases, such as that of Sergeant F, that may well have played a role for Stevenson's own case analysis. But in response to Stiles' account, I would like to emphasize one crucial cultural connection between brain science and literature. The crux of this connection is an earlier literary example of the double, namely E.T.A. Hoffmann's Doppelganger in such texts as Die Elixiere des Teufels and Die Doppeltgänger. Hoffmann is mentioned as the fictional life model by T.H. Huxley in his essay on the hypothesis that animals are automata. Huxley argues, as you can see quoted in the middle here, Huxley argues that Hoffmann's terrible conception of the Doppelganger is realized by men in this state, who live two lives, in one of which they may be guilty of the most criminal acts, while in the other they are eminently virtuous and respectable. Recent criticism on Hoffmann in German studies has argued that his examinations of psychic fragmentation in the mode of the fantastic doppelganger already lay out a logic of the unconscious that predates Freud significantly. As Annemarie Opp states in her entry on Doppelgänger in the Hoffmann Handbuch, quote, and I'm translating, E.T.A. Hoffmann's literature can hardly be separated from the science of the doppelganger. It has contributed to the genealogy of modern psychology from its very beginning. As this brief foray into 19th century theories of mind and brain shows, even without recourse to later theories such as Freud's, there were many ideas in the air, and if you allow me the pun, well, is it even a pun, brains in texts, for Stevenson to critically examine and playfully comment on. Stevenson's shift of the common metaphor of the theatre of the mind to the theatre of the brain is an indication of the relevance of this neurological research, but it also links back to fundamental questions of authorship, as I show in the next section, the theatre of the brain and the question of authorship. Stevenson's first paragraph opens the essay with an essayistic discussion of memory that uses two meta-literary devices. With their literariness foregrounded in the first clause of the first sentence, this draws attention to the textual quality of the woven text and the strands of memory. Quote, the past is all of one texture. On the one hand, the terms Stevenson uses at the beginning of the essay appear to be drawn from popular novel genres of the 19th century. Stevenson later on mentions the hope, quote, in proper storybook fashion, of, for example, the unexpected inheritance of colonial riches, a trope found not only in children's adventure stories, but also realist novels. Yet Stevenson's overall emphasis appears to be on the model of the Gothic novel, beginning with a very emphasis on the past. What is more, in Gothic fashion, this past is feigned or suffered, remembered when darkness and sleep reign undisturbed in the body. There is a sentimental and nostalgic feeling that suffuses Stevenson's description of a past that is all gone, past conjuring, when everything left is air-painted pictures of the past. The second meta-literary device is worthy of further attention because Stevenson repeatedly uses it throughout the essay. It is that small theatre of the brain which we keep brightly lighted all night long after the jets are down. Later in the essay, this theatre reoccurs as a surgical theatre in the student's nightmare at Edinburgh College in the 4th paragraph, as man's internal theatre that is operated by the little people or brownies, and also as the theatre of the mind, in one in which chronology is hazy, according to Stevenson. This metaphor of the small theatre of the brain that opens Stevenson's text and occurs repeatedly is usually read, as I explained in the previous section, as an anticipation of Freudian psychoanalysis, and sometimes also through its precursor of unconscious cerebration. This term, coined by physician W.B. Carpenter in 1853, meant, according to the OED, quote, that action of the brain which, though unaccompanied by consciousness, produces results which might have been produced by thought. One of the examples of its popularizer, Francis Power Cobb, gives of unconscious cerebration is that when we walk, quote, some unseen guardian of our muscles manages all the details, unquote. Yeah, so you can definitely see some links. Cobb also mentions fairies as unseen, so there are definitely some links to Stevenson's brownies. At the same time, the materialistic change from the theatre of the mind, the more common metaphor which Stevenson also uses later in the text, to the theatre of the brain, may be viewed as providing additional evidence for Anne Stiles's claim that Jekyll and Hyde demonstrates Stevenson's awareness and critique of contemporary theories of the double hemispheres of the brain. There are other predecessors that I would like to take into account. They include philosophical ideas of the mind, as well as a textual cluster of occurrences that link this idea broadly to the question of religion and the original author of God, which is thus doubly relevant for our question at hand. Philosophically speaking, the origins of an idea of a theatre of the mind may be traced back, at the very least, to Plato. His allegory of the cave may be read as an illusory theatre of the mind, and Bernhard Zimmermann has recently argued that Plato's texts are, quote, pure theatre of the mind, unquote. In both the Scottish and the empiricist philosophical tradition, the most apparent reference point is David Hume. In the section of personal identity in the Treatise of Human Nature, Hume had argued that, quote, the mind is a kind of theatre where several perceptions successively make their appearance, pass, repass, glide away and mingle in an infinite variety of postures and situations, unquote. As is apparent from his letters, Stevenson had planned a book on 4 great Scotsmen, which included Hume among them. These more general philosophical ideas certainly form a background for Stevenson's use of the phrase. But if we search for exact predecessors of the materialistic phrase theatre of the brain, for example in the Google Books corpus, another tradition emerges that appears to be of more immediate relevance to authorship. The phrase the theatre of the brain occurs very rarely in the 18th and 19th centuries before Stevenson uses it. Many of these earlier, or the few that are there, the few earlier occurrences in the 19th century form an interesting cluster around the defense of religious faith against scientific development. The phrase is recorded, for example, in Transactions of the Victoria Institute or Philosophical Society of Great Britain, which was explicitly founded to resist the ideological threat of Darwinism to religion. However, the most similar phrase to Stevenson's appears in an essay on English education by Angus MacPherson, published in 1854, before the appearance of the origin of species. Yet, Angus MacPherson's motto already promises to unite science and religion. Speaking of phenomena beyond our earthly experience, MacPherson exclaims, and I quote, "What a god-like faculty of the mind that can bring such glorious beings to play their wondrous parts within the little theatre of the brain," unquote. While primarily intended as a defense of God by MacPherson, his phrase on the divine faculty of the human mind also epitomizes the use of the theatre as a metaphor of authorship. Against the background of the earlier uses of the phrase, then, the contextual difference of MacPherson's use in comparison to Stevenson's small theatre of the brain is instructive. The original authorial creator in the Christian interpretive framework is displaced in Stevenson by the mythological figures of the brownies. So where in Macpherson, it's quite clear that the original author who is responsible ultimately for operating the little theatre of the brain is God, in Stevenson, it's the brownies. In effect, Stevenson's metaphor of the small theatre of the brain not only materializes authorship, but it also makes it small, be it cozy or constricted, but definitely not that of the very model of autonomous authorship, namely that of God. Okay, after this really minute attention to the beginning of the essay, let me turn to an overview of a chapter on dreams in a bird's eye view, or perhaps also, of course, in a God's eye view. So this is a chapter on dreams as a textual double of Jekyll and Hyde. Stevenson's essay consists of approximately 4,900 words in 11 paragraphs. If we regard a chapter on dreams with regard to its explicit auto-commentary on Jekyll and Hyde, it falls strikingly short of our expectations. The section explicitly on the novella is a mere 390 words long, less than 10% of the 4,900 word essay. Still, these passages, of course, remain the most often quoted. Stevenson explicitly discusses Jekyll and Hyde as conditioned by, on the one hand, heteronymous demands of the marketplace and autonomous demands of literary art, turning this tension into a kind of double of the demands of literary authorship. And I quote at length, "I can but give an instance or so of what part is done sleeping of creative work, of literary work, is done sleeping and what part awake, and leave the reader to share what laurels there are at his own nod between myself and my collaborators. And to do this, I will first take a book that a number of persons have been polite enough to read, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I had long been trying to write a story on this subject, to find a body, a vehicle, for that strong sense of man's double being, which must at times come in upon and overwhelm the mind of every thinking creature. I had even written one, The Travelling Companion, which was returned by an editor on the plea that it was a work of genius and indecent, and which I burned the other day on the ground that it was not a work of genius, and that Jekyll had supplanted it. Then came one of those financial fluctuations to which, with an elegant modesty, I have hitherto referred in the third person. As is clear in this passage, the motif of the double informs both the literary text of Jekyll and Hyde and Stevenson's narrative of its origin in a chapter on dreams. This also turns the literary text of Jekyll and Hyde into an allegory, of literary production, as Patrick Brantlinger has examined in detail. Such an allegorical move is also typical of Gothic authorship, not just in Poe, but also, for example, in Mary Shelley's preface to Frankenstein. As Caroline McCracken Flesher puts it, in Jekyll and Hyde, Stevenson's doctors dissect themselves. In a chapter on dreams, Stevenson dissects his moral, economic, and literary aspects as an author, yet leaves himself intact too. Like Jekyll in the literary text, Stevenson does most of the morality, while his Hyde-like brownies have not a rudiment of what we call a conscience. The immoral aspects, such as the business of the powders, are ascribed to the brownies. Even the manuscript of The Travelling Companion is turned into an evil double, supplanted by the more successful Jekyll and Hyde. While the aesthetic aims of Jekyll and Hyde and a chapter on dreams seem to be quite different, mystification, if you like, in the case of Jekyll and Hyde, versus clarification of its origin in a chapter on dreams, such a simple opposition does not do justice to the complexity of either text. Indeed, if we read a chapter on dreams as a narrative of its own, some of its incidents, cases, and narratives map rather neatly onto Jekyll and Hyde. For instance, the number of their units is quite similar, 11 paragraphs in 10 chapters, respectively. Hence my suggestion to read the texture of the whole of a chapter on dreams as a double of Jekyll and Hyde. Most crucially, as I've discussed in comparison to Poe already, a chapter on dreams doubles the progression of Jekyll and Hyde, with a pronoun shift revealing that he, the dreamer, is Stevenson, the author, paralleling the final denouement in Jekyll and Hyde. And I quote from a chapter on dreams, which you can also see in bold on the page. Well, as regards the dreamer, he is no less a person than myself. And of course, there are also dissimilarities, which I'm not going into in detail. And of course, there are huge differences between the two texts. But nevertheless, the general similarity in number, and also that idea of a kind of narrative reversal, really an anagnorisis almost in Aristotelian terms, is, I think, quite a striking similarity and a decisive similarity between the two. The 11th section of a chapter on dreams, of course, is quite interesting in that regard. It's the final reflection on the brownies, and it's also a kind of Derridian supplement. And this is what leads us to the unseen operators of the theatre of the brain, the brownies, which Stevenson's text positions, I argue, as invisible literary doubles. So I'm already going to leave that overview, but perhaps there's something else on this that we can also discuss in the Q&A. So the next section is on Stevenson's brownies as invisible literary doubles. As Barry Murnane has it, the literary doppelganger, quote, emerges as an unsettling figure because it renders problematic any fixed sense of individuality or subjectivity. It is a figure of identity as crisis or identity in crisis. The term doppelganger was coined by Jean Paul in his novel Siebenkäs, and Murnane identifies Germany as a privileged site of formation around 1800. Besides Hoffmann's writings, which we've already discussed, the tradition of outside of Scotland includes, for example, Poe's William Wilson, but it may also, as I've argued elsewhere, be used as a figure of thought in understanding the authorial relationship between Frankenstein and his creature. And I apologize for quoting myself. As a figure of authorial identity, the doubling of Frankenstein and the monster unsettles Frankenstein's originality. The doppelganger renders problematic the myth of the solitary genius of the Romantic author, unquote. Within 19th century Scottish literature, a quick search may lead us to rather ephemeral texts such as George MacDonald's The Wise Woman or The Lost Princess, a double story from 1875, which I have to immediately own up to not having read, but maybe someone in the audience has. But the crucial Scottish model is certainly James Hogg and his anonymously published 1824 novel, The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner. And we will come back to Hogg in a bit in connection to the brownies in particular. What makes a chapter on dreams special is how Stevenson unites the literary idea of the double and its complex history with the mythological idea of the brownie. Here's the second central part of Stevenson's description of the origin of Jekyll and Hyde at length. For 2 days I went, and of course no accident, 2 days, right? I mean, you always, in authorial author commentaries, you always have the question, to what extent this is still a literary fiction and an invention. It's very possible, that it was 2 days, but of course it's also too fitting for the motif of the double, 2 days, the second night, and so on. Okay, so to quote Stevenson, for 2 days I went about racking my brains for a plot of any sort, and on the second night I dreamed the scene at the window, and a scene afterwards split in two, in which Hyde, pursued for some crime, took the powder and underwent the change in the presence of his pursuers. All the rest was made awake and consciously, although I think I can trace in much of it the manner of my brownies. The meaning of the tale is therefore mine, and had long pre-existed in my garden of Adonis, and tried one body after another in vain. Indeed, I do most of the morality, worse luck, and my brownies have not a rudiment of what we call a conscience. Mine too is the setting, mine the characters. All that was given me was the matter of 3 scenes, and the central idea of a voluntary change becoming involuntary. Will it be thought ungenerous, after I have been so liberally ladling out praise to my unseen collaborators, if I here toss them over, bound hand and foot, into the arena of the critics? For the business of the powder, which so many have censured, is, I am relieved to say, not mine at all, but the brownies. Here the brownies appear as Stevenson's means to displace authorial responsibility. In such a way, they work, of course, strikingly similar to Hyde in the novella. As unseen collaborators, they assist on the literary marketplace. And Stevenson also says, quote, the whole of my published fiction should be the single-handed product of some brownie, some familiar, some unseen collaborator whom I keep locked in a back garret, while I get all the praise and he but a share, which I cannot prevent him getting, of the pudding, unquote. Indeed, the brownies, as Patrick Brantling has argued, quote, are Stevenson's doubles, creatures hidden inside the waking personality who beg comparison with the dwarfish or gnome-like Mr. Hyde, unquote. What we need to add to Brantlinger's convincing account of the pressures of the mass audience of the market on literary authors is an emphasis on the cultural specificity of the figure of the brownies. While Canadian Palmer Cox had published stories, arguably ancestors of modern comic strips, about the brownies in newspapers from 1879, the brownies retained their specific Scottish qualities at the time of Stevenson's essay. As the OED has it, a brownie is, quote, a wee brown man, that often appears in Scottish ballads and fairy tales, unquote. Others explain that, unlike the fairies, who were notably gregarious, the brownie was a solitary creature, usually male. It is striking that Stevenson mainly speaks of his brownies in the plural, considering that the mythic creatures would only be one per household. So here we meet again that complex tension between the singularity and the collectivity of authorship in Stevenson's rewriting of the solitary brownie into their collective brownies. Popularized in the early 19th century, brownies were household spirits that were supportive as long as they were not offended, for instance, by the gift of new clothes. The Victorian writer of children's fiction Juliana Horatia Ewing identified the brownies with well-behaved children who help in the household, and the children who do not live up to this Victorian ideal as boggarts. In Ewing's tale The Brownies, the oldest son of a tailor realizes he can be a brownie himself after talking to a wise old owl. When the grandmother tells the children of the brownie that used to live in the household, they ask, "Did they give him any wages, Granny?" Even before Stevenson, the brownie could thus function as a figure of productivity under the conditions of wage capitalism, a theme that occupied Stevenson considerably at that very point when he became a commercially successful author and was afraid of being a sellout, basically. The Scottishness of the brownie is particularly apparent in another double text, and this is where they meet, where Stevenson's aspect of the brownies as a double, the Scottish literary history of the double and of the brownie meet. And this is another text by Hogg, besides the private memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner, namely Hogg's first novel, The Brownie of Bodsbeck. In that, Hogg combines his interest in the Covenanters of 17th century Scottish history and in Scottish legend by using the brownie as a mythological persona behind which a leader of the Covenanters can hide. There are no real brownies in Hogg's novel, but they have an effect on Scottish history. Not only by virtue of their folklore status as Scottish, but more specifically as an echo of Hogg's earlier text, then, the brownies are decisively Scottish in Stevenson's text. As Ian Duncan argues, Hogg's first novel enacts a particular type of Scottishness that negotiates with Englishness and tends towards political independence. In the novel, Duncan maintains, quote, to imagine a primitive covenant of fairy time is to recall its loss. Hogg comes very close here in the novel to investing his fairy world with a political allegory of national independence, unquote. Viewed against this background, then, the brownies in Stevenson's text exhibit specifically Scottish meanings of politics, history, and productivity that were nevertheless relatable to a US audience. Turning the brownies into a double of his own writerly self in a North American commercial context, Stevenson playfully weaves a Scottish thread into the texture of the past that opens his text. To conclude, Jekyll and Hyde famously predicts the future of man as, quote, a mere polity of multifarious, incongruous, and independent denizens, unquote. This may easily, perhaps too easily, point us towards the question of Scottish independence or toward the idea of the Caledonian anti-syzygy, an idea just as influential as resistant to obsolescence, and one that is based on Gregory Smith's idiosyncratic reading of Stevenson and Stevensoniana. Penny Fielding has argued that, quote, Stevenson's imagination works by the dismantling of antitheses. What the analysis of a chapter on dreams has shown I hope, is how the essay doubles Jekyll and Hyde, but also how the brownies double the author Stevenson. In characteristic fashion, Stevenson's text works through doublings and is always on the verge of further multiplications. The processes of writing and dreaming are constantly under threat of being further multiplied. Indeed, positively phrased, they contain multitudes of little brownies. Yet they also run the danger of exploding into an uncontainable multiplicity, as, for example, in the ending of Jekyll and Hyde. In any case, I argue, the most interesting double, not in but of Jekyll and Hyde, is Stevenson's A Chapter on Dreams. Thank you very much.